Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be looking at the market cycle ROI, or return on investment. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, it's been at least a few weeks since we had a dedicated video on the market cycle ROI, and we'll take a look at it as measured from the lows from 2022 and from the highs of 2021. And we'll compare that to prior cycles to simply see where are we in that general path that we typically follow. So if we break up the prior cycles and overlay them, we can see that there are two cycles which arguably could be combined into one, the blue line and this sort of this red line right here. If we ignore those and just sort of throw those out, you will see that Bitcoin's current cycle, the purple line, is actually still following the last two cycles relatively closely. If anything, the current cycle is actually ahead of the last two cycles. Now, that might seem odd, but it has happened before. In fact, if you look at the last cycle, market cycle 4, and you just compare the green line to this yellowish line, yellowish orange line, you will see that last cycle there were several times where the ROI as a function or as measured from the lows was actually ahead of the prior cycle. Ultimately, the cycle before had a higher ROI in the end, in line with the expectations of diminishing returns. Although back in 2021, this was a very contested topic. The idea of diminishing returns was something that was seen as against Bitcoin and not really believing in it and all that stuff. And that was why a lot of people thought it was going to go to 300K that cycle. But ultimately, we did put in diminishing returns as measured from the low. And what you will see is that last cycle from the low, Bitcoin went up about 20x or so. The cycle before that, it had gone up about 100x. So a much more impressive move the last cycle. And then the cycle before that, it went up about 500x. So there's some form of a pattern there in terms of, 1/5. But what's interesting is if you look at the last cycle, we got well ahead of the prior cycle before that. And then ultimately it cooled down and went below that cycle. And then it got ahead again and then cooled off a second time. Now, if we pull up the current cycle, we can see that we did get ahead of the prior cycle briefly early on. And now we've gotten ahead of it again. Now, one of the reasons, arguably, we've gotten ahead of it is because this happens to correspond to a comparison from the prior cycle when we had the pandemic. And that was a pretty major crash by Bitcoin at the time. You can see that we were actually keeping pace with that last cycle fairly closely from days 356 to days 450. I mean, basically 100 days where the ROI from the low for the last two cycles was nearly identical. But now this cycle is ahead of the prior cycle, and it's also ahead of the cycle before that as well. But again, this is not something out of the ordinary. We witnessed it last cycle multiple times. Okay? And I think it's almost expected. I think in terms of the market cycle stuff, the further out you get, right, as you're comparing to increasingly parabolic moves of the prior cycles, it's harder to keep pace, the further out you get. But in sort of this area over here, you can see it's basically any cycle's game to have the highest ROI from the lows. Even the market cycle 3 that ended up going 100x off the lows, it basically stayed below a 3x move all the way up until day in the 500s, right? And we're currently in day, what is this? The 460s or so. And then the last cycle, while it got above that 3x move relatively early on, it didn't durably get above a 3x move until almost day 600, which would correspond to several months from now. So that's one way to compare it, is to measure it from the 2022 low. The other way is to measure it from the highs, right? And again, we can take out that first cycle and just look at the current cycle, which is the green line, and compare it to the last two. And if you measure it that way, you can also see that we are ahead of where we were in the prior cycles at this time. In fact, as measured from the peak, both prior cycles at this point by day 831 were only at an ROI from the peak of 0.34 to 0.37, meaning that Bitcoin at this point in the cycle was still down about 65% from the high in those prior cycles. Now, for reference, just so we are aware of what a 65% low or drop from the highs would be, 65% down effectively has you at around 24K. Now look at last cycle, 65% down at this point in the cycle, right? I mean, it happens to correspond to the pandemic drop, but if you go to the cycle before that, 65% down, around this time, right? That is where we ultimately were. And so when you measure it like this, you can see that we are greatly exceeding the last two cycles as measured from the peak. In fact, this orange line, right? So if we look at just the last cycle, if we were, just to give you an idea of how brutal that was back then, you can see that going back to a level such as that would put you essentially back near the lows, which is effectively what happened last cycle. I mean, we had the pandemic and we essentially retested the lows. It was a slightly higher low. But it does really go to show just how just how much this cycle has been outperforming the last cycle at by this stage of the cycle. Furthermore, it has continued to outperform the cycle before that one as well. The only one that has outperformed this one as measured from the peak is the cycle before that one, which at this point was a lot more elevated in terms of where it was as measured from the peak. But this just is a way to measure the ROI of Bitcoin. And look, I mean, there's been all sorts of people that talk about, the upside potential and the downside potential. And, when we rallied through this level over here, my response was, all right, well, there's no sense in trying to get too cute, trying to time wherever it's going to find a local top before a larger pullback. I mean, you can guess all you want, but it's, standing in the way of it. I mean, again, like even looking at the ETF launch, right? We had a pretty long wick. We came back down, and then we just took that one out as well. So a pretty substantial move here by Bitcoin. Oftentimes, at least historically, has taken a little bit longer to get to this ROI as measured from the peak or as measured from the low. You can see that we are ahead. At least in the prior cycle, though, while we were at a lower ROI at this point, there was a previous area back over here in sort of that 200-day range where we were essentially at these levels and actually just a bit higher. And that actually also correspond to, late Q or, well into QT and also just before rate cuts arrived. We saw a very similar move with essentially a very similar ROI as measured from the low. It still hasn't quite made it, all the way. I mean, if you look at this level and sort of draw a line across, just going to get that ticker out of the way, you can see that it actually went just a bit higher in those cases. But I think this is an interesting way to look at the market. Certainly easy to focus on the day-to-day stuff and looking at moving averages and all that other stuff. But sometimes it's nice to just take a step back and look at what's going on. And it's a reminder, right? I mean, while Bitcoin could continue to climb, it's also a reminder that whenever a pullback does occur, if it is a larger pullback at some point, more than just say a 20% drop, it would still be within the realm of prior prior moves, right? I mean, this shows you that, right? I mean, it clearly shows you that even a larger drop, if it were to happen after, say, some type of event, um, would still likely be within the realm of prior moves at this point in the cycle compared to those respective cycles. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So, you know, later on in the cycle, when there is a deeper pullback, which I mean, usually there are like 30 to 40% pullbacks at the very least at some point, it'll be interesting to compare, see where it is and how it compares to the prior cycles and at what point does that occur. And just kind of does it keep pace or does it eventually fall back below, just kind of like this cycle did over here? So something interesting to think about. I just want to provide an update on this, and that way, maybe every month or so we can just check in where Bitcoin's market cycle ROI is as measured from the peak, and of course as measured from the lows. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.